This is Democracy Watch. So, Mark, we have some breaking news here as we await for a decision from the Supreme Court in the coming weeks on whether Donald Trump is immune from prosecution. We've just learned that Clarence Thomas has accepted even more luxury gifts from Republican megadonors, even more than were previously reported. Mark, what happened here? Is it typical for a Supreme Court justice to simply forget that a conservative billionaire paid him to fly out to Bali, fly out to private clubs in Northern California?
So look, this is not the first time that Justice Thomas and some of his colleagues have had this problem of seemingly to forget to report gifts and only to have them appear later. And you're right, the magnitude of these gifts is quite large. So, the justices fill out an annual report that requires them to disclose some basic financial information, by category of range, what stocks do they own, what other investments do they have. It also requires them to disclose gifts. And that is a law that applies, by the way, to people in the executive branch. It applies to members of Congress, and it applies to judges and justices. And the fact is that in this instance, we are once again facing a circumstance in which Justice Thomas is belatedly disclosing gifts that should have been disclosed some time ago.
This is the first round of disclosures since the Supreme Court adopted its first ethics code back in November of 2023. In your view, how do you think that ethics code is panning out right now? Has the Supreme Court taken any meaningful steps toward accountability over the last 6 months?
I mean, not great, right? I mean, the ethics code...
Apparently.
I suppose the glass half full is that it's disclosed.
Right.
But the fact is, look, this is not happening in a vacuum. This is happening at the same time that we are dealing with some very, very important issues before this country that where people expect the Supreme Court to rule on matters that involve Donald Trump. And we have had Justice Alito seemingly not able to control the flagpole in front of his house, not aware of the flagpole in front of another house. He doesn't like, by the way, if you didn't know, Brian, he doesn't like flags.
Right. I've heard, yes.
Yeah. And so this is not instilling confidence. And one of the reasons why I point that out is that the role of judges is not just to do justice and not just to be impartial, but to give the appearance of doing justice and being impartial. And I think it's very, very hard to look at the collective set of events we have seen over the course of the last couple of years as we culminate towards these very, very important Supreme Court decisions and not have people raise the legitimate question of whether there is a conflict or not, whether or not the Supreme Court is meeting the measure of the appearance of conflicts. And, something you asked me about last week in an earlier episode, and I hope people go back and watch that one, was about whether Chief Justice Roberts should have met with the Senate when he was asked to. And I said, it's really unfortunate the Supreme Court, that the Chief Justice, who is the administrator of the entire federal court system, did not take that as an opportunity to meet with the Senate. And now, as you point out, people are left asking, well, how is this whole ethics code working out? Well, Chief Justice Roberts could have at least taken some steps. Presumably, I would hope he is not blindsided by this, and this is not breaking news to him. He could have taken some steps here. So I think it's a real missed opportunity.
Well, let me ask you this. Is the point of the ethics code to actually get them to just disclose these things or to prevent them from actually taking them? Because the latter seems like the more important part, but the practical effect of this ethics code, as toothless as it may be, is just that they will disclose what looks to us like their improprieties.
Yeah, so I think you've put your finger on another sort of disconnect, right? You can have a system where you prohibit gifts or you prohibit certain holdings, or you can have a system where you allow them, but you have to disclose them. The ethics code is a little bit of a hybrid of the two, but at a minimum, it seeks to ensure that where there are permissible gifts, and let's just put a pin in that for a moment about whether these were permissible gifts, but where there are permissible gifts above certain dollar thresholds, you at least want them disclosed. Where there are investments above a certain dollar threshold, which are, by the way, pretty low, the thresholds, you want them disclosed. And so if you fail on the disclosure part, then you've kind of lost the entirety of the enforcement mechanism.
Now, new data disclosed by a Supreme Court watchdog this week found that over the last 20 years, the dollar value of the gifts received by Justice Thomas specifically is more than 12 times any other Supreme Court justice over the same period, and more than 40 times more than any other justice nominated by a Democratic president. So what do you think it says about the state of the media covering the Supreme Court that Justice Clarence Thomas very clearly feels comfortable over the past 2 decades accepting these luxury gifts, so far beyond what his colleagues were accepting, and not feeling any, pressure to relent in the slightest bit?
Yeah, so I think you make 2 really important points here, and I want to emphasize these separately. The first is that the scale of these gifts is really unprecedented, right? Like disclosed, not disclosed, regardless of the role of the media. These are very, very large gifts. This is not, the ethics code was originally intended, the Ethics in Government Act was intended that, someone would get tickets to a ball game, for $500, and it would have to be disclosed. Yeah. People, these are very, very large dollars that we're talking about. And as you point out, they are larger than their colleagues, but I think it's actually fair to criticize the court as a whole on the size of even what the colleagues are getting, right? I mean, the Supreme Court justices should not, in my view, be routinely accepting any gifts beyond courtesies. And like I said, that may involve, a gift on a birthday or a gift, to a gala event.
As opposed to a gift that somebody gives when they have business before the court,
right. But I'm saying, but those gifts would still be in the hundreds of dollars or maybe $1,000, right? So I think that's one question. But the second thing you point out is, I think, really a condemnation of the media. And I don't say this lightly, but where is the media on this? There are reporters whose job it is to cover the U.S. Supreme Court, and I think you have to collectively look at that group of reporters and say, how is it that so many of these things have been going on, whether it is the flag controversy or whether it is the gifts, and these things are not being disclosed or brought to the public's attention by the reporters dedicated to covering the Supreme Court. These are actually being brought to the public by people who are sort of, like you said, watchdogs. And so, you would expect that if there are scandals in the White House press corps will uncover them. If there are unusual things happening in Congress, the congressional press corps will cover it. And I think there is a real need for the major news organizations to examine how they are approaching the covering of the courts.
Mark, let's finish off with this. The justices do have a few more weeks until the end of the Supreme Court term. Can you remind our viewers right now which decisions we should be looking out for over the next few weeks here?
Yeah, look, I think we're in for a rough few weeks. I hope I am surprised, but I think realistically, what we have seen from the conservatives in the last few terms is that they tend to not just bundle the most important cases to the end, but they actually tend to bundle the worst outcomes. In some ways it's very Trumpian. They wait till the very end, and then they put them all out in 1 day or 2 days. And so it becomes hard to process just how bad it will be. So look, we obviously have the 2 cases that involve insurrection. We have the case involving the interpretation of crimes committed on January 6th, which could directly impact Donald Trump's own criminal cases. We have the Trump immunity case, where he is looking for absolute immunity for the time that he was president. But then we have some other really important cases. We have a case about whether or not the courts will continue to defer to agencies in the interpretation of their own rules. And, a lot of really important cases are pending. So I hope everyone is following Democracy Docket, and I hope everyone is following this Democracy Watch series, because, Brian and I, not to invite myself back into another episode, but I am sure that as soon as there are outcomes in these cases, you will hear from us.
Absolutely. And again, for those watching right now, if you want to hear about this stuff immediately as soon as it breaks,